Let's just pray. God, once again, we come to you and we just ask that you would do the speaking now. May this be your story and not Team Expansion's. May it be your story and not mine. May it be your story so that you would get glory and credit for all those people who work so hard to make this happen. In Jesus' name, amen. Our story begins in about 1990 in November. I was teaching at Cincinnati Bible College at the time, and we would bring in a missionary in residence to come and speak a semester at a time. And a particular missionary in residence at that time happened to be an avid reader, an avid news watcher. He would come up and he'd put his hand on my shoulders. I'd be sitting there at the desk and he'd be saying, "So when's Team Expansion going to start its new work in the Soviet Union?" And I would laugh, because we all knew that was impossible. Even TCM, which for many years was known as Toronto Christian Mission, and then became known as Taking Christ to the Millions. Now it's called Training Christians for Ministry. It's the curse of an acronym. You forget which one it is right now. But anyway, TCM had been involved in the work in the Soviet Union for many, many years, probably 20 years by that time, had never had a single person live there because everybody thought it was fruitless and impossible. So I always laughed and thought he was joking, and he kept walking in, putting his hand on my shoulder saying, "When are you going to send your first person to live in the Soviet Union? When's the first Team Expansion team going to go?" Along about October of that year, 1990, I got an email that told about a Lausanne Congress that was going to happen in Moscow, and it was designed primarily for Soviets. There were going to be 1,000 Soviets and 100 from every other country on earth. And they were going to limit it at exactly 1,100. And they wanted 1,000 Soviets because they wanted it to be primarily a conference by Soviets for Soviets to figure out what's the future of all the unreached people groups within the Soviet Union, what we called then the USSR. Lots of people lumped it together and called it Russia. And they meant by that the whole 13 time zones. And we really didn't understand it back then because we grew up in our school kind of fearing it. When we were real little, and our moms and dads, they would have these drills and make people get under their desks in case, what was it called? You drop or whatever. Wasn't stop, drop, and roll, but something like that. They would have you get under your desk and hide in case there was an atomic bomb dropped. And I've thought back now, how is that going to help you from an atomic bomb? If you've ever seen an atomic bomb blast. But that's what we thought about Russia. It's just somebody to fear. And we really didn't understand the diversity of peoples there, but this group did. And it was being managed by a group out in the Pacific Northwest and also down in California, as oftentimes groups do, manage things from the Pacific Northwest and down in California. And I just kept hearing Wes Paddock's encouragement that we had to get somebody to live there. So I just asked him to start praying, and I started praying, and I thought this Congress would be a great way to get there. We prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed, and finally I sent a letter. Back then we didn't have email, but I mailed a letter off to this group that was in charge of finding the 100 people to go. And I explained my situation. I was just a prayer, at heart. I wanted to figure out what our ministry had to do. Didn't hear an answer. Finally, fax machines were just really getting into big use. They'd been in use for maybe about, 4 years, maybe. So we sent a fax, thought we were really big shot stuff, big stream thing. We did get a fax back, and it said a form letter. It wasn't even addressed to me, form letter. "We've received your information. If we decide to invite you, we'll contact you." Nothing else happened. Finally, I called and got the office, and the secretary said that the guy, Bill, that's in charge of invitations, wasn't really available, and also, they're really sorry, but they'd already invited the 100 people, and I didn't make the list because they were only getting people that were interested and involved and already experienced in the USSR, people like TCM. So I called TCM and asked if somebody from TCM was going to go to this, and they said, "Oh, no, we don't think that's necessary because we already have this ministry going. In fact, if you get any money in for this, just send it to us, and we'll take care of whatever ministry there because we got this handled." And they said, "You really don't need to live there. Just keep making trips in like we're doing." And they would hand out Bibles and visit people and then go back to wherever they were. It just didn't sit right with me. So I faxed one more time and I called one more time. And this brings us to where I think the first lesson I've learned from this case study, the first principle. To me, church planting movements often are birthed only when people show a tremendous sense of determination to make them happen. And I don't know if that's something that, Kherson and everybody writes about or not. I don't know. But it just seems like that's a takeaway from this particular experience. It got to the time where I understood that it was the final day, that they were concreting in this whole Congress, and it was in the final hours, and the guy would never return my call. I'd never spoken to the guy named Bill. And I worked into the evening that night. It was probably 10 o'clock that evening. And I was at my house talking to my wife and said, Penny, I feel really bad about this. I've just badgered these people to death. And she said, well, honey, what else is new? That's just what you do. And I said, well, but I feel bad because, the guy's probably going home. Time went on. It finally got on to where it was like maybe about midnight. Penny was long in bed. And I just finally decided I would try to reach the guy at his house. So I called Director Assistance, and lo and behold, I got his home number. And I called his home number, and by this time it was bound to be 10 o'clock in the evening. And the guy answered, and a conversation ensued, and he finally said, is this the guy that keeps writing me from Cincinnati that wants to go to this Congress? Yes, it is. Well, don't you understand? What don't you get about the word no? We are not interested in you going. This is for experienced people in the USSR. I said, well, I got a vision. The vision was that, you remember the parable of the widow and the unjust judge? Remember the widow just kept approaching the judge, kept approaching the judge, kept approaching the judge. Judge wouldn't have anything to do with it. Kept approaching, and finally, there in, Luke 18, he finally grants her request, and you almost get the point that he sort of does it because he realizes either she's very determined and she must really want it bad, or else he wanted to get her out of his hair. I don't know which it was, but he finally grants her request. And so Bill said, oh, so what does that make me? So I don't know, I'm just telling you the story from the Bible. The surprising thing about the whole thing was he laughed. He really laughed. He chuckled. And he said, let me just stop here a second and think about this. The Soviet Union is such a messed up place right now. It is probably only going to be changed by people who won't take no for an answer. And now it just suddenly has dawned on me. You seem to be one of those types. Well, sir, I don't know. I'm just telling you a Bible story. No, wait. You seem to be one of those types. You will not stop at any obstacle. Well, I don't know, sir. I just really feel called that this is where our mission needs to go. You're invited. You'll have your invitation tomorrow. We'll fax it to your desk. I was flabbergasted. I hung up the phone and I thought, for once, this. But it occurred to me then, the second thing is that these church planting movements seem to only come at sometimes great emotional cost to the people that are involved in them. And that emotional cost can become so much so that you almost become so personally invested that you begin to feel like you're on a mission from God. It feels like that if you don't do this, that you will not be able to go to heaven. It's like this is a calling that you will go to hell if you don't make sure you get an invitation to that meeting. And as the conversation closed out and I said thank you, I said, oh, by the way, Bill, could I bring a translator? Oh, I can't believe you just said that. And he said, yes, you can bring a translator. Because I knew no Russian. And all the other people that were part of that 100, they were all used to working in Russia. I knew no Russian. God delivered a guy. We went there. And we met so many fine people. And in this Congress, they gave us lists upon lists of all the different unreached people group in what was then the USSR. I had these lists, and I began studying them. I picked out a few that I thought would be very strategic. And I remember I was eating lunch one time with a man named Gale. His first name was Gale. I won't say anything about that. And as we were talking, he was a famous researcher. He's from a group out at the Great Pacific Northwest called Issachar, which was all based on this scripture and remind me where it is, where the Issachar were the people that they knew the times, as strategic times. And this guy was from that group, and he was talking to me about this, and he's sliding papers back and forth, and we were talking. He's looking at all the unreached people groups that I identified, and the idea was Team Expansion would try to take responsibility for one of these groups. And we all thought it was going to be very scientific. We're going to study it real. And this guy kept coming up and interrupting us at lunch. And finally, I just turned around and said, I asked the translator guy that come with, would you see what this gentleman wants? And he told him, and he just wants you to come down and help with his church camp. I said, would you explain to him, sir, please forgive, but we're not doing church camps. That's not what we're about. He explained to him, and the guy he kept coming up during that lunch. Finally, it was like pestering us to death. I finally turned around and said, sir, please, we're just trying to get some research done here. And Gail said, wait a second. I don't know if you want to tell this guy no. I said, what do you mean? Ask him again where he's from. Gail didn't speak Russian either. Ask him again where he's from. The translator, Mark, asked him, and he turned the paper around and he drew a circle. He was from right beside where one of those people groups lived. the Crimean Tatars, right beside it. And he said, there's your answer. Standing right here wanting you to go to a church camp. This is your unreached people group. And I thought, this guy has just done with me what I had thought I had learned with Bill. And I didn't recognize it. So we sat down with him, and his name was Igor, and he was a part of a delegation that had come to sing in a choir of all things. And he just wanted help with his choir. He wanted help with his church. And this really seemed weird to me because we really didn't come to help a church. So I thought, this is all kind of weird. Finally, they introduced the choir. Wonderful people. Oh, extremely hospitable. They bombarded me after it was over. Oh, so you want to come? They were all saying in Russian, saying through my translator, so you want to come down and help with our camp? No, I really don't. Oh, yeah, come this Sunday. I'm going home this Sunday. No, you need it. Where's your wife? Is your wife here? No, she's back. You need to fly her here. Come down and be here this Sunday. You can speak in our church. They just kept after me. Imagine. Mark finally turned to me and said, Doug, remember your lesson with Bill that you just talked about? They really want you to come. We have to go. And a lot of fun stuff happened. We went to buy the air ticket, and they said, you can't go. We're under regulation. You can't go down there unless you have a visa to go. So what do you mean a visa? We're still in the USSR. It's not leaving your border. Well, you need a different visa for that. It's all divided up into different pieces, and you had to have permission to travel from one to the other. Lady wouldn't give us permission. So finally I thought, okay, I've been overseas some. What do you give a lady to make sure that you get permission? May the Lord forgive me. We took her a bottle of vodka. She gave us the visa in 5 minutes. So we get on the plane, I fly my wife over, we go down. The whole congregation treats us like we're a king and welcomes us in. This was the only established church in the whole city of 500,000 people, on the edge of a people group of 210,000 people that were all unreached, all Muslim. So as we were brainstorming and thinking about this, I finally turned to Penny and I said, this is different than how I'd imagined, but what if this church could become a partner with us to help us reach the unreached people group? And she said, Doug, look around the room. There's not a single person here that doesn't look alike. And I looked around, they all looked identical, all Ukrainians just to the T. Just a beautiful city with a lot of really beautiful people. As I was preparing to tell this story, I looked back through this book, and I'll just pass this around. It's a beautiful city with a lot of stories. They all looked identical, like they were the same family. And I found out why afterward, because they had undergone severe persecution. Chased by dogs, people turned, German shepherds and Russian wolfhounds loose on them, chew them up alive because of their faith. Another principle I walked away with was that sometimes these church planting movements happen in places where it's kind of almost out of vogue to become Christian. Isn't that weird? It's like backwards from how you would expect. Everybody thought Christianity was the opium of the people. They'd been told that. Everybody thought that this was all just a bunch of bogus lies and rumors. And these people that had survived, this remnant of this church, many of them 70 years old, had lived through the most terrible persecution. And yet, they had survived in the midst of all this persecution and held the torch high. It was the only church of about maybe, I don't know if it would have been 150 people, maybe 150 people in the middle of this city of 500,000. After the service, we talked about this in principle, and they said, sure, we'll help you reach out to the Crimean Tatars. And I turned to my wife, and why do I feel like this is like arms for hostages? Sure, we'll drive you around and show you the communities if you help us with our camp. It just felt like that, And I didn't want to really think anything like that, but that's the way it felt. They drove us down, and we went through villages, the Crimean Tatars. No, my heart just jerked and just tore because the situation, these Crimean Tatars had been banished off this peninsula back in 1944, I guess. They had been shipped out, and they'd been assumed to be traitors to the Soviet Union people, supposedly. I think that the Russian big shots wanted their property for their summer dachas, their summer cottages. But they shipped them off. They shipped off probably 150,000, maybe 200,000 of them. Many of them died. They were in railroad car after railroad car with the doors locked. They had to ride for like 20, 30 days to go out to places like Samarkand and other spots, places where they just put them in this big like reservation and just fence them in and keep them there. It's not unlike what we did the Indians. Just stop and think about it. And then they took their land, and they enjoyed it in their summer cottages, And now the Soviet Union's in turmoil, and these guys saw their chance to run for it. They were all running back home. So another thing I noticed throughout this whole story is, oftentimes, another lesson I took away, oftentimes church planting movements happen in the midst of great like movements or great upheavals. Let's use that word. It's like an upheaval of something. These people were coming back. They were racing back and they were squatting and claiming their land. And by doing that, they thought, hey, we're driving our stakes down. Well, nobody knew if it was legal or not because the Soviet Union was in the midst of, remember the words, perestroika, restructuring, glasnost, openness. And all this was going on, kind of, threatening that the government might change somehow. And so nobody knew for sure, are these people allowed to do this or not? They'd come in with bulldozers, bulldoze down their shacks. They just come back at midnight and build them all back up again. And nobody knew what to do with them. And they drove these little cottages, and people were suffering. They were out in the cold, and, you could see their fingers were blue. And I just said, we've got to get back here. So I came back, told the story at several colleges, told the story around Cincinnati, went to church after church and told the story. And, out of this, I was shocked. By the time we were done, a local church had decided to partner with us on this side too. And that was a good-sized local church with a lot of speaking power. The preacher, Dick Alexander, said, we're going to tackle this with you, Doug. Glenn Elliott was his associate. We're going to tackle this with you, Doug. We're going to try to make this happen. What do we do next? So we started brainstorming out what we did next. And we thought this might be strategic to utilize this local church that we'd found there in Kherson. So what are some other lessons I'm learning? Well, it helps to build a network. That's another lesson I'm learning, is that if I would have gone over and tried to do this by myself, I think it could have maybe started in 5 guys or something, but I think it really helps to build a network. We had that local church there that said they'd help us. We had the local church in Cincinnati, and before long, we had a 2-week team, get this, of 47 people who would come over for 2 weeks to help kick this thing off. And the idea was that we would come over with a team of summer-long people. There were 36 of them that decided to go with us. And they would get there the week before, set everything up. These U.S. folks would come over, and we'd do this big multimedia sort of blitz. And in this big launch, which we called Ukrainian American Christian Friendship Festival, we would try to get the word out, and we would try to cross over. I don't know how to explain this, but to try to make it believable that you could actually become a Christian. Because in this whole city, nobody really thought that it was popular, nobody thought it was vogue, and all they had seen were these survivors, and they all wore these bonnets, and the men wore these suits, and none of them wore makeup, and they just didn't fit with society. It was 2 different things, like they were a bunch of nuns and monks and living in the middle of Beverly Hills. It wasn't popular to become a Christian. And so we thought, we'll just bring in these folks that are young and vibrant. We had guys that were doctors and nurses and agriculturalists, and we had people that could lecture on things like the blood, and scientists and engineers. We had marketing people. We had people that were experts on developing things and the development of the city, and engineer types. We had a real collection of people that had lots of gifts, and teachers galore, lots of teachers. And then among our summer workers, we had a lot of people who were very compassionate, people that were genteel, people that could listen to a story and tell it. And boy, we utilized a key booklet that we asked permission of a guy to translate. This was 1991 now, in the spring of 91, a booklet by a guy named John Hindi. John Hindi. The booklet was called A Peace Treaty with God, and we worked with several Russians in the Cincinnati area and got it translated. We pretty much followed John Hindi's original material, but we made sure that it was contextualized, so it would fit from a Russian mindset. So we translated it by dynamic translation instead of word for word. But of course, all the scripture was kept exactly relevant. In the whole thing, we always decided we wouldn't sell out the scripture. We would just present the Bible with what it was and let that be the authority. So we got this translated, and we printed like thousands and thousands and thousands of these booklets. And another thing I took away was it really helps to have some kind of a piece, some kind of an identity that people can see. I don't know if you think of it as a booklet like this, or you might think of it as a Jesus film, or maybe, I know Frank likes that little EvangeCube thing. I mean, there are different things like that, but whatever the piece is, and I think it really helps to use mass media. So we landed with this setup crew, and it just went exactly the opposite of like clockwork. Everything we had set up in advance. I'd gone there in the spring to do all the setup work. We had everything arranged. I thought, we got there and everything fell through. People would say things like, there's no way that you're going to use our theater, the largest theater in the city, to show a movie about Jesus. We'll all be arrested. Don't you get it? It's against the law to do that here. And I would just listen to the whole story, and after they were done, I'd say, now, how do we know it's against the law? Look up on my shelf, and there would be all 54 volumes of linen. Look up on my shelf, it's against the law. Well, that's a great series, but it's not the law, is it? It's just philosophy and thought. How do we know it's against the law? Look. And they'd hush, and they'd lean over, and they'd say things like, you say you're a man of religion. Yes. Do you know where I can get a Bible? Do you know where I can get a Bible? I'd say, well, I could try to find you one. They're very difficult to find, you know. Okay, listen, if you can get, this true story, if you can get us a Bible, if you can get me my own copy of the Bible, please make it a nice one. If you get me my own copy of the Bible, you can have the theater. Okay, I don't know, we'll try it, we'll do our best. Walked out of the car, threw open the trunk, there were hundreds of Bibles back of my trunk. Threw back the trunk, waited some, so it made it seem like it took a long time. Went back in, look what we found. It was all wrapped up in brown paper. Yes, sign here. Biggest theater in the city, Jesus film every night. I mean, it became like a splash. People were walking up and down the streets with sandwich signs on. And we made friends so quickly that I couldn't believe how rapidly the news spread. Hundreds of people just streamed into these theaters. We finally, by the time the week was over, we rented every theater in the city. There wasn't one single theater left. So it didn't matter what you wanted to go see. If you wanted to go see Pinocchio, you had to go and see Jesus film. We blitzed the whole city with Jesus film, with all kinds. And every time somebody would say, what is this, Jesus? Oh, you need to read this. And we go do a walkthrough with them. Now, very quickly, after these hundreds and hundreds of people, we had 600 people that had signed forms saying they wanted to do a home Bible study, which indicated to me there was some degree of openness that nobody counted on in this city. And another thing I took away from this case study was, really God is the one that's in charge of this stuff. It's really not us. In other words, who in their right mind would have predicted that this would have happened? And as we were there through that summer, the Moscow government was collapsing. And it wasn't long before, I remember the very morning I got up and I turned on the television, and it was the Committee of Eight that had taken over the government, and Gorbachev was being held captive in a summer cottage down in near Yalta, where we were working with the Crimean Tatars, by the way. And Yeltsin was on top of this army tank up in Moscow. And I realized as I watched that film, as I watched that TV show that day, we were living out a time in history that nobody could predict what would happen. And right away, my phone started to ring. I was the team leader of this team, and by now it had pretty much thinned out. The 2-week people were gone, the summer people were gone. It was just the 10 of us that were going to stay after and try to mop up and clean up. And we had formed maybe 3 or 4 home Bible studies, and we had started working with these home Bible study people. And one by one, these 10 people that are on our team, US of A folks, started calling me saying, what's going to happen? And there was a guy among us that had been with the Defense Language Institute in the Army, and he turned into an intelligence officer, so he thought he knew a lot about the Soviet Union, and he did. He said, based on all my experience, this place is going to erupt in bloody civil war. We got to get out of here now. I mean, there was a sense that we were going to suffer. There was a sense that we were going to be caught in the middle of a war. And whenever there'd be a helicopter go over, you kind of ducked. It would just, emotionally, it was already happening. And it made me think that our lives were on the line to do this. And I got to say that there was something that was really unique about that. There had been maybe about, by that time, I would say probably 20, maybe 18 people that we had baptized, primarily by using these booklets. That night, spontaneously, without us even inviting them, all 18 of those believers came to our house to be with Penny and me. And I looked around that room, and by this time I could visit, I no longer needed a translator. In fact, it was just Penny and me, and none of the other team members were there. As we talked with these 18 new believers, I suddenly felt like that we were at a critical turning point in the movement. Why? Well, first of all, because US of A folks were in the minority. Now it was 18 new baptized believers and 2 gringos, 2 US of A. And I also could tell just by the questions they were asking, we were at a critical point. One of them, a ship's captain, said, if they come after you, I could put you on my boat and I'll take you across the Black Sea and smuggle you out. They'll never get you, Douglas. They'll never take you. Don't you worry, we'll take care of you. And another man, he held up his hand and he said, but what's to become of us here if you leave? We have just given our lives to Christ. We don't know how to act. We don't know how to believe. What do people do in our situation? And the girl that was the daughter of a Communist Party boss who came to Christ, I believe, at great cost with her family. Now she would be ostracized by her Communist Party boss dad. She said, and I have a question. If it's so important for the rest of the people of our city to learn about Jesus, how will they ever learn? All these questions fell in the laps of those people. And that night, with their shared leadership, they, and I was facilitating, decided to form a special initiative group. We called it the Initiative Committee in Russian. And it was a night when they felt like they were starting something, but they didn't know exactly what it was. Now, by this time, the existing church was pretty suspicious of us. They had noticed the way that we would welcome into our groups people that wore makeup, and people that danced, and people that were not from a Christian family. They were from a rebellious family, and people that were from divorces, and people that were mixed up, and drug addicts, and we just were taking everybody. And they got mad and finally said, Douglas, we can't help you if you're going to take in all these people that don't fit in the kingdom of God. And I was just trying to listen and be humble, but I never knew what to say. Finally, they said, okay, we'll compromise. You go on and keep doing that. We'll maintain the pure church here. We'll give you one of our believers to be a kind of spy, to make sure that he keeps us informed about what you're doing, to make sure you don't do anything that will embarrass us any more than you already have. And this spy will kind of help you. And they picked a lay person among them, and his name was Zhenya. Now, this lay guy was a welder. He had never entertained the idea of becoming a preacher, really. He just was an elder in the local church. Yes, he did speak sometimes. He wasn't particularly eloquent, but he was a caring guy, and he had a family, and they liked him, and he liked me, I think. And so they gave us this guy and said, Zhenya, you go with Douglas. Wherever he goes, you follow with him. You will be our ambassador to his group, our spy, wherever he goes. So Zhenya was there with our group, and Zhenya was listening the whole time. And finally, he spoke up and he said, this is scary to me because it has the capacity that we could be viewed as a non-registered church. And I said, well, this is not a church, Zhenya, remember, this is an initiative group. Okay. So they finally decided to meet, and we always met in borrowed places. We never met in a church house. We met in homes. We met one time in the ship's training center that the ship's captain got us. We met in a library meeting room. We met all around. And finally, it took on a flavor of the group that meets in homes, the group that meets in different places. And whenever we would meet, we would always ask questions. We went through this book. We'd ask questions about the book of Acts. And finally, I just started leading them through the whole book of Acts. We studied through it from beginning to end. And when we got to the sections that talked about churches being started, it was very interesting to them because they'd never read this before in their lives. This is the first time. Zhenya would listen in. He had studied some, but he didn't know this stuff very much. And finally, we got to the end of the book of Acts, and I pointed out, well, the chapter's still going on. It ends abruptly. And they said, so what are we to do? I said, well, it's up to you. What do you want to do? So, well, we must start home meetings, just like they did here in Acts. Well, that sounds like a great idea. Who will start the first meeting? And they started volunteering. These were Russians, Ukrainians, in other words. They weren't United States folks. And out of these home meetings, they became the spokespersons for this new thing that was happening that no longer looked exactly like the Dom Molitve church that they had always defined before it. Now it looked like something almost counter-cultural. It looked like something kind of adventurous and revolutionary. It looked like something that they could get their arms around because they liked something like that. And as time went on, these groups began to grow. But no one group actually knew the people in the other group because they all started groups in their homes or in other people's homes, and they never really were together. Finally, it occurred to me one day, for this thing to really take off, it has to have, when they talk about hydrogen bombs, the critical mass, atomic bomb, it has to have a kind of critical mass. They have to all believe that it's actually going to be okay for them to do this and for them to share this. And the funniest thing, I remember the very specific night when this came together, we invited them all to the circus. And you might call this circus evangelism. And I've thought about it since what an odd idea it was, how unreligious it was to all go to the circus together. But that night was such a weird thing. we had bought enough circus tickets, so they could all sit together in a block. And we didn't really introduce them very much to each other. And one by one, they'd little by little finally strike up a conversation with the person sitting beside them. And they'd realize that they had also started in a Bible study. And he had also started in a Bible study. And you could just see it as Penny and I would look behind us. One by one, there was all this chatter going on, till finally it swept across. We had bought 1/4 of the entire circus out. There were these 70 people up there from all different homes. They were all just chattering with each other. Finally, when the circus ended, nobody wanted to leave. And I turned around and smiled, and many of the leaders knew me. Some of the people from the houses knew me, but some of them didn't. It was the first time they met me. And we talked that night there at the circus. What would we do? And they'd all come to the conclusion together. They had to multiply. So we started meeting in a meeting hall that was associated with the place where Xenia was a welder. So again, we never were in a church building. This is all just homes. It was just public groups. And from there it grew. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, Xenia would be the one up front doing the speaking. And he had never spoken before. He wasn't very eloquent, didn't have this big education that qualified him for this. What he had was a heart, though. He had a heart. And, don't believe that people would come, and they'd not like this. And they'd, shake their heads. This is not good. And they'd leave, because all these people were non-Christians. Little by little, more people come. We kept going down to the river, kept baptizing more, kept leading them through the study more and more. And as this happened, it began to multiply. Around that time, we decided that we had to set it free. And we would send a teacher back that would work with them, but basically they were going to have to start teaching on their own. So I moved with my family to the Crimean Peninsula and moved in right beside a Crimean Tatar settlement. And we said we would go down and we'd carry back news from these Muslims, because all the time, the whole time we're starting the whole thing, I would always talk to them about the fact that, remember our purpose. Our purpose is to try to reach these Muslims for Christ. And that's why we originally started. But in the process, what I didn't realize was all these people would find Christ too, and they were just nothings. They were agnostics and atheists and nothings. They were just communists. They didn't have any Muslim background, but they didn't have any background. They didn't go to the Orthodox Church. They wouldn't have claimed orthodoxy. And as these people grew, it was astounding. People would come from Clover Nook and they'd do teaching. Finally, Glenn Elliott came and lived there with them for a period of about 5 years and operated kind of like a mentor to Xenia and others, mentoring and teaching and helping them, and then Xenia would go out and teach it. This church grew, and the groups grew along with it. In the year 2000, I went back and made the circuit again through these places where we had visited. I was astounded at what had happened. Glenn had been long gone. He had been gone for about 4 years. So these people were left totally on their own. There was not a single United States sent missionary, from Team Expansion or otherwise, that was working there with them. This church now had 1,000 people that was worshiping every single week together. And they had 8 full-time staff people. And they paid all their own bills. We didn't send them money or anything. They had established 42 different churches through cell groups multiplying by helping send a guy out to this town, helping send a guy out to that time. He had started that. And I didn't believe this. I said, well, they tell this to all the people who visit, and they hope you'll pay for a church building. So I said, well, can you take me to some of these places? They started taking me to some of the worship groups. These people had restored basements. They had outfitted. I remember we went to this one place that was a bread factory, and they had set up this factory so they could be bread by the week, and then afterward they folded up and they made it into a meeting hall for Christians on the weekend. And I went to group after group after group. They were all focused toward one guy that they knew, and had all been growing out of one nucleus. The guy that they knew and the nucleus out of which had been growing was Xenia. And this is the first time they had met me. In fact, Xenia, when he would introduce me, would say, Douglas was the guy who brought the team that came to Kherson that actually started this. You know the book, The Priest Treaty of God? Oh, yeah, we've got a copy of it. Douglas was the team that brought that. They were introducing me for the first time to this group. It had all happened without us really realizing it. Now, here was a really cool part. They also took us to this place down in Crimean Peninsula where they had a church of 30 baptized Crimean Tatar Muslims that had given their lives to Christ. Now 30, I know, doesn't sound like a big number, but for us, it was huge. These were 30 people that had been Muslims all their lives. They had become Christians at great, great cost, knowing full well that they would be kicked out of the village, kicked out of their families, wouldn't have any part of future of Crimean Tatar stuff, and they did that in spite of it all. And what it represented to me was, this represented a fulfillment of the original dream. Remember going up to Moscow and picking out the Muslim group? what we didn't know was that God's going to do this other stuff along the way. So that's kind of a summary. I wonder if there are any questions, any comments. Kind of a fun thing to be a part of. Questions? A lot of times where you felt like that it could only have been God. I remember, for example, the night after the 18 or so people had met at my house, that night we discovered that my wife had lice. And suddenly we started checking our kids' hair, and the kids had lice too. And you know, lice is no fun, especially there. They didn't have any medicine for it, so we couldn't get rid of it. And that night, I remember also was the night that the whole thing was happening in Moscow, and I was monitoring the stuff out in the shortwave, on my shortwave radio out in the front room, and I fell asleep on the couch. And as I woke up, and I still don't know if this was a dream or if I was just in a dazed state looking out the window, but I saw at this window the shadows of a tree moving a little bit in the wind and a silhouetted light from behind, and it looked like the shape of a bat. And I thought for sure I heard this voice whisper and say, "You will not succeed. You will not succeed." Now, it might have been a dream, just all that, paranoia going through my head, bloody civil war or whatever, Should we stay? Should we go? Should we go across the Black Sea, ships captured? Should we stay? All that stuff was going through my head, Might have just been, and then this black bat thing, "You will not succeed." Kind of had this demonic sort of feeling to it. And I remember then suddenly I was just as awake, at least I felt like I was awake, as awake could be. I remember all these people had always said to us in Bible college, "By the power of Jesus Christ." So that's all I knew how to say. I said kind of halfway out loud, not so loud it would wake up Penny back in the bedroom, but I said, "By the power of Jesus Christ, we will be victorious. We will win." But it was like this kind of, sort of like this clash that I remember feeling that night. And the lice went on, and Chris was attacked by dogs in the market, a whole circle of 8 dogs, and I didn't know how to do that. I stomped up at these dogs trying to scare them away. I didn't know anything about it. And he was 4 years old at the time, a little 4-year-old kid being, surrounded by these yelping dogs, and just terrified him. And bed bugs, our apartment got filled with bed bugs. I think that a part of this for us was the spiritual battle, the struggle of just trying to figure out, is this for real or not? Is it a sign that we're supposed to go home, or is this a sign that somebody doesn't want this to happen? The whole thing started up in Moscow when we got there with Chris coming down with a terrible, terrible fever and listless, just completely listless. We took him to doctor, and a big story about how that the emergency room, the surgeon wanted to operate on him, saying he had an abscess and it could break and send poison to his body. And I couldn't stand the thought of, cutting open my kid in a Russian hospital. And at the time, they didn't have any medicines or anything. They didn't even wash their sheets. They didn't even have food at the hospitals then. And I remember taking him to this hotel and thinking, what will I do? And there was a phone booth in the middle. I think we just call our family doctor. And we called. It was in the middle of worship service. And he was in the middle of church, and the associate minister saying things like, "I'm sorry, we don't disturb the doctor during church. But this is Doug calling from the Soviet." "Oh, well, I know where Doug is. He's in Russia, so you wouldn't be Doug. There's some kind of mistake." "But I'm calling from Russia." "Oh, I'll go get the doctor." "Yeah, I'll get the doctor." And he said, "If you just had some Benadryl. If you just have some Benadryl, it's too low, because this might be an allergic reaction." And Penny began fumbling in her purse. I remember thinking at the time, I'm not kidding, I remember thinking, great, our kid's going to die and she's going to freshen her lipstick. She reaches in her purse and she pulls out this medicine bottle, printed on the side, handwritten, it says Benadryl, "in case you need it." They'd given her this medicine before we ever left the state. Some nurse up in Andover, Ohio, named Nancy, had given her this and said, "just in case you need it." Had it in her purse. We checked the dosage, gave it him. 4 hours later, he's running around again, just like normal. And I thought, all this spiritual stuff was going on behind it all. And now if you go to that church, they've even sent, it wasn't, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, I was playing in the soccer game over at KCC. It was the night before, and this guy I struck up a conversation with there on the deck of the pool, he laughed when I told him what I did. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Well, I would never become a missionary, but the funny thing is, my wife's always trying to get me to become one." "Well, maybe you should listen to your wife." He laughed. It was a big joke the whole time. And we talked about it a little bit longer, and I gave him some information, but he just laughed and said, "Well, it's kind of like you won't catch me dead doing that." It was the Tuesday. By the way, we won the game, and he was the one who gave me the great pass to make the goal that won the game for us. And it was alumni versus the current players. On the Tuesday after the game that was on Saturday, I got a call from him of all things. He said, I'd like to come down and talk with you. And I said, well, sure, but why? Well, you'll find out when we get there. And it was a big mystery. They came in, I think, on that Thursday, and they walked in the office, and right away I recognized his wife. I thought I did. She just reminded me of somebody. And she said one word. She said, Douglas. Douglas, pronouncing my name in Russian. And I said, I know you. And she was probably 25 years old. She said, you knew me when I was 10. She was a little girl that lived in Kherson. And as our workers would walk by, she would always see them. And she would always say to her mom, who was Russian, why are these Americans always so happy? And her mom would say, I don't know, and you'll have to ask them. I can't speak English. Well, you'll have to figure out how to speak English then. And one day she said, hello. And these two girls from our group started inviting her. Lo and behold, she came up through this movement, and they baptized her one day. Finally went up through high school, got her a scholarship to go to Kentucky Christian College. Met this guy, married him. They moved up to Columbus. We were sitting there on the deck, and little did I know, I was talking to the guy that she married. She had become a Christian in the very church in Kherson that started in this movement. And when the guy got home, tears had filled her eyes when he told her the story. She said, that's the guy. That's the guy that started our church movement in Kherson. Oh, that couldn't be, honey. That couldn't be the guy. His name was Douglas, and he was just frozen. And he took it as a calling from God. And today, Chris and Ira Vilwalk are team expansion missionaries in Bosnia, sent out not only by churches from here, but also churches from Kherson that are working together with that team in partnership. It just makes me think God had a plan here. And I just had the unique kind of wild ride to be able to be a part of seeing it all unfold. So there's a lot of fun. And of course, now, you know, they keep on growing, and you can visit that church someday if you want to go to Kherson, Ukraine. Any other questions? Okay, turn over to Eric, or thanks everybody.